Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. Today with me, I have a special double guest episode with Leo and Jesse from maitri.network. Welcome, guys.
Hi,
Thanks for
thanks
having
for
us,
having
Nick.
us.
Yeah, I guess the first question before we kind of dive in, wanted to just ask, where did the name come from? It's a cool one, and I didn't know if there was any meaning behind it. Good.
Jesse, go ahead.
Oh yeah, it's a variant of a Sanskrit word that means like kind of open love and kindness, friendship, all the aspirational goals of the social network that we're aiming to build.
Cool. Um, yeah, I mean, I've been doing like my own little deep dive for the past few days on my tree, but like I won't put words into your mouth. How would you describe like what's like the pitch for how you would you describe it? Would it be like an attestation network or something slightly different?
Yeah, it's more than that. There is the stations that are part of it, but in a greater picture, it's a really a re-architecture of social media, of kind of a thinking from first principles of if we wanted to build the ideal and architect the ideal the social media ecosystem, how would we do it? And so there's a couple. Today we're used to social media having social graphs and sometimes the main historical form is centralized social graphs with applications such as Facebook or Twitter. And then we've been, the space has been exploring decentralized social graphs with things like Lens and Farcaster. And so it can be centralized or decentralized, but basically you have the main components are social graphs and applications that exist today. And we want to add a couple of other components to that. One is an interoperability layer to allow all these different social graphs and applications to talk to one another and create a greater network effect. And another component is to augment social graphs with what we're calling community graphs. So still have social graphs, which are these one-to-one mappings between people, but also be able to map group memberships, how we belong to certain groups, and to what extent we belong to certain groups, not just binary, but on a 0 to 100% kind of spectrum. So it's really adding these two components and re-architecting the whole thing to produce much more meaningful and better results for society. That's kind of the big picture. Anything you want to add there, Jesse?
No, I think that about covers it. This makes a good intro.
Yeah, no, I mean, I guess if I could just ask a little kind of a deeper question on like, what do you guys mean by social graph? Like, is that I'm a Twitter user or I'm a, Farcaster user? Is that a social graph or is it like much more broad, I guess?
A social graph is more of an infrastructure technical term, and it's really how we map to one another. So on Facebook, you have friendships, right? And I'm friends with you, or you're friends with someone else. All those mappings are, if you add them all up, that is a social graph. Who are all your friends? Who are all their friends? You can imagine this kind of graph building out from that. Um, those types of relationships are symmetrical. Like for you and I both have to agree to be friends. LinkedIn is the same thing. We have to connect mutually to one another. You can also have asymmetrical type relationships. I follow you on Twitter, or I follow you on Instagram. Doesn't require you to approve it. And those are just one-way mappings, but still you build out a social graph. You end up with this mapping. And so what we've seen in social media is that there are extremely strong network effects to social graphs. Once you've developed this mapping, it's extremely powerful, and everyone wants to be on the same graph. And that's when we talk about everyone being on the same network, that is really the network effect. It comes from the social graph. And so whoever owns a social graph and whoever is able to gatekeep it owns that entire network. And that's become extremely problematic in social media because in any one use case, that company can then wall that off, and it leads to these winner take all outcomes. Whoever, because they're really strong network effects. If you have a leader in a certain space, they have the largest network than their competitors. They can wall that off, and then everyone from the smaller networks jumps to the larger social graph, so they can all be connected with one another, and it kills off all the competitors, and you end up with a monopoly. So you end up with a monopoly. Facebook is one use case. LinkedIn is another use case. Professional connections, sharing pictures. Instagram, that's another use case. Tweeting, that's another use case. You end up with a monopoly in every single space, because of these winner take all outcomes. And the fundamental problem is that as long as one entity can control the social graph or own the social graph, that's the outcome you get. That's the most profitable thing for them to do. And so that's why, one of the solutions we've seen in this space is decentralizing the social graph, like what Lens or Farcaster are doing. We're going to put the social graph on some peer-to-peer network or blockchain. Nobody owns it. Everyone can plug into it. And that's one way of making it so it's not a monopoly outcome. You technically at a technological level, you decentralize the social graph, and that has its pros and cons. But before we get into all that, hopefully that answers your question about social graphs.
For sure. Yeah. Man, I already have like a bajillion questions.
Yeah, take it any which way you want. We can.
Yeah, no, I think like maybe it would be helpful. I can like save a lot of my questions for like reasoning or like whether or not what pieces of the social graph are good or bad. I think maybe we can just get like how the protocol is working or planning to work. Like actually like if I wanted to use this, what does like the actual infrastructure look like underneath? So we start from like a technical base, and then we can figure out, from what you have built or are planning to build, what can we actually do with this stuff? So yeah, maybe if you want to walk me through, like what's sort of, how do you guys look at what's the base of the tech stack for you guys?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where we can go two big directions here, and eventually we'll circle back to the other direction. One is interoperability. How do we just take all these social graphs and make them interoperable into one larger, greater network, so that you can, as a user, use Lens and Farcaster and a bunch of centralized social graphs with that might be run by smaller teams, and still aggregate all of them and make it so it's not a winner take all outcome. So that's one thing that we're addressing with an interoperability layer. And then the other thing is, how do we create something that's, how do we go beyond social graphs? Because when we think about how we interact offline in the real world, we form our relationships and maintain our relationships within the context of groups and communities, and it's really our belonging to groups that really empowers a lot of the way we engage with one another, the way we move through life, the way we trust one another, and the way we meet one another, and so on. The things we say to one another is within the context of the group that we're in. It can be, the things you would choose to say or disclose, or even the way you would say them, depends on your audience, depends on the group, depends on your shared experiences. So how do we bring all that also, into the digital sphere that we're sorely missing? We just have social graphs, but we don't have mappings to groups. So we're missing that entire context, and that opens up a lot of doors, unlocks a lot of new use cases and just better experiences. So we can take it, one direction first or the other. Which one are you? I guess
I'm thinking like the end use case, like for creating a social, whether it's a social media platform or it's almost like a digital identity, if you will, that you're creating in some ways. So like maybe is the end use case that you see, like talking about it being interoperable, is it like I'm a governance protocol on base and I want to know about you voting? Is that like part of the goal, or is that something?
That's certainly one of the use cases. It opens up a lot of use cases, right? And when you talk about identity, the identity is such a broad thing because you can define it narrowly, like this is my name and my address or whatever else might be part of it. But the way we actually move through life, our identity, and this is touched a lot. I don't know if you're too familiar with kind of the space around plurality and pluralism. There's an entire academic space there, but the way that we define ourselves is by all these different groups that we belong to and all these different interests, and it's really kind of the intersection of all these things. And so ultimately, when you start thinking about a broader identity, it is, who do we have relationships with, which groups do we belong to, and so on. And so it does touch very, very closely on identity as well.
Yeah, I mean, all right, cool. Well, I'm gonna try and focus myself and let's
Sure.
get like, so what are we putting on chain? Are we doing anything on chain? Or is this all off chain stuff?
Yes. So when it comes to, when I talked about social graphs, the need for them to be decentralized, ultimately we are, when we take community graphs, let's start with community graphs. Those will be on chain, and so it will be this mapping that will exist in a decentralized manner. Ultimately, some pieces of it will be on chain, and some pieces of it will be in off chain, but still decentralized. You can think of like peer-to-peer decentralized data structures and so on. But yeah, if we start with just the basic mapping of communities, you can think of a Venn diagram, right? Of if you just draw out all these different groups that you belong to and all these communities you belong to, you represent each of them with a circle, and they all partially overlap one another. And where they overlap is where you are, right? And so yeah, you have all these different belongings to all these groups, and that you don't just belong or not belong to one group, because in some groups you're much more central member. You might be the very center of the group. In other groups, you're more on the periphery. And so in each group, you can imagine your membership to that group being between 0 and 100%. And so the way that is determined is everyone in a group, like who ultimately chooses who is more of a group than somebody else. It's the other members of that group. And so everybody privately attests for one another's level of membership. And it's important that this type of attestation, you can think of it as a type of voting, is private, because otherwise, any kind of public voting, you can have coercion, bribery, social pressure, all that stuff, basically corrupt those votes. So you have these private attestations, and that's put through a algorithm that any community can choose its own algorithm. We built one out so far that we think is pretty decent, but other people can build on that or improve on it. But it's put through an algorithm, and then it spits out this data of everyone is a member between 0 and 100%. You might be 30%, Jesse might be 10%, and so on. And then that's the basic infrastructure. You have all these groups with all these members with their membership levels. And now what can you do with that? You can, any application, like a social media type application or looking to serve communities, can use that data. Yeah.
Let's go into a little bit more detail about these attestations before we move on, because if this is a bit of more of a technical talk, in addition to the privacy, we can talk about the subjectivity and the fact that they're only positive. The attestations are only positive, and also the manner in which that you already touched on a little bit about how they're non-binary. Do you want to cover those before we move on, or did you want to loop back to that for some reason?
I guess let me leave that. How would you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, just maybe to cover things now, just for the sake of being comprehensive in terms of the order and flow. So Leo talked about privacy being an important component of this, and really in contrast to that, you have vouching. So like vouching needs to be public necessarily. At least the interested parties need to be known to each other, so that you can have accountability, right? Like if you vouch for someone, they need to, like the person who might need to hold someone accountable needs to know where to go. And Leo talked about like kind of the awkward social pressures that can lead to the consolidation of power, the way that like certain types of personalities are going to accrue vouches. That becomes like a self-reinforcing mechanism, and the privacy preserves for that. That's probably covered pretty well. The subjectivity, that's my favorite part of this attestation mechanism personally, because in the way that you have like anytime you set metrics or like a target, say rules for an airdrop, as soon as the players know the rules of the game, they're only going to perform those actions to get them the prize, right? And so you constantly end up having to change the rules of the game, not to improve the rules or to improve the game, but just to, it's that cops and robbers loop. But the subjectivity here means that each of us we're going to think about different people that for different reasons, to different extents, we value their participation and contributions to any group that we're a part of. And we do that differently. And that subjectivity that is internal to us and that we don't have to reconcile with anyone else makes the system not just more resilient, but more robust because of that. Because how would a person game all of us? I mean, certainly some of us are more socially adept than others, but you're talking about a really, really robust way of evaluating these people's contributions and participation to any group, because of that subjectivity. And then the fact that these attestations are only positive means that you're not downvoting anybody. That's really important. And then lastly, there's the non-binary nature of this, as Leo touched on, that like 0 to 100%. I think that just about takes us through all the things I wanted to hit there.
Like I would, if this is me, I would like basically make an attestation. It would be private and somehow, or it's on a private chain, and then I would say like Leo is part of the Ethereum crypto community here with me. He runs a great project and he's cool. So I'm going to give him a 95 out of 100 on the scale. And then is there? So I guess the way that you guys would have it is there. Are there built-in weightings, or would the user? I guess what you're saying about being it subjective, the user, whoever's looking, would pick almost how much they weight my attestation, right? So
in a way, so the what you can produce as results, you end up with intersubjective scores, right? So everyone in the community sees the same score for everyone else as a result, right? So the inputs are subjective, the results are intersubjective, but you can also have an algorithm that produces subjective results. So you could do it in a way such that everyone for me maybe sees 30%, but you for me see a 60% because of kind of this web of trust concept that says, well, here's what you voted for me, and here are the people that other people you voted for, that what they voted for me, and combining that in a way, and that could become very useful in certain instances, depending on what you're trying to use it for. For now, we just have intersubjective results, but you could also imagine having subjective results as well.
But I mean, like,
and then the way that
how do you pick the community's size? Like, how do you? Because like communities, even of themselves, like in the Ethereum community, like. It's such a broad community, like there's like we might be, there's like the pluralist community, and then there's like the degen community, and there's like the list guys who we don't like or whatever, and like, so like would we all for the same community, or would it be separate?
Yeah, I think you're touching on the most important part, and the way that you're talking about all the different subsets of communities, that's the thing that you really key into. So, the Ethereum community is not this like homogenous, monolithic group of people that all think the same. Just like any other community, it's subsets of subsets of subsets, and there's a couple different ways that you can scale. You can try to scale past Dunbar's number by by reaching out to everyone and trying to make them part of a larger group, and that breaks down rather quickly and predictably. The other way to go is the opposite of that, saying that like you trust your family better than your closest friends, better than your neighbors, and you kind of like you try to you steer people back toward the smaller groups with higher quality interactions around points of common interest, and then you make it easier for them to move between those groups. So it's the overlapping memberships of smaller groups that makes up the larger Ethereum community as more of an emergent property.
So
so on a technical level, anyone can create a community, and they can choose who can join that community. This is all very modular and composable, and we'll get to that. But anyone can create a community. They can choose the permissions around that. So like anyone can join, or anyone can join with this email address or with this NFT, or anyone can join based on being invited, by these people and so on. And so when that just gives you the very basic starting point of a community, because every community ends up being kind of fuzzy around the edges. It's not that every community is clearly defined, just like in real life, it's not clearly defined. It's more, well, some people are more central to it, some people more on the periphery, and the community is kind of in between those things, just as how we're used to interacting with these things. And so it gives you that kind of fuzziness, which is really important, because we don't all have to agree on exactly where the boundaries are of any one community. These things become a little bit more manageable with smaller numbers of people. You can have these smaller communities around, what is the plurality community, and even sub-communities within that. What is the degen community? What is the, Ethereum research community, and the developer community, and so on. And And then what Jesse's saying is you can start after that mapping certain communities to certain parent communities, like subcommunities of those, and so on, to start to build up what it means to be part of a larger community as well. So that gets a little bit more advanced, but and we'll also get into reputation systems as well, which can become useful for this stuff. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question around. Yeah, because if we all just joined one giant community of 100,000 people and said this is the Ethereum community, it starts. You wouldn't get meaningful results. You get meaningful results for someone like Vitalik. Most people there could agree on Vitalik, but like as individuals. But if you start allowing for these smaller communities and then start building them up from there, everyone can have their own mapping of what it means to be in the Ethereum community. Like, I think these sub communities are actually part of it and these other ones aren't, and you can start building it out that way.
No,
And that's really where the intuition for all of this comes from, and that might be helpful for context there to talk about like where community graphs comes from is a lot of conversations around like the future of Zuzalu, where Vitalik was making the decision to decentralize, and it leads to a lot of questions around like, who's allowed to use this name, and what's a Zuzalu aligned village, and who's allowed to apply for grant funding, and how do you balance inclusivity and exclusivity when you're talking about who to invite to future events and how to gatekeep access to these kinds of communities. So there were a lot of questions in those conversations, and aspirationally, a lot of people were looking up to Burning Man as an organization, as an example of something to emulate. When we find out months later that Burning Man has all the same problems, just at a larger scale. So community graphs was really our best answer to how to improve on vouching as a simple mechanism that is like really insufficient for these purposes.
Yeah, and that gets into, sorry, go ahead.
No, I think what you guys are talking about, like it's cool because I've seen this problem with like crypto communities in general, and probably it sounds like with Burning Man too. Like you start out small, but then like with most social media, as it grows, it turns less of a community and less of people into more of a platform where you're trying to just perform and speak out to the masses in a big way.
Yeah, that's
any
exactly
organization where you scale past, you scale past the point where leadership knows personally everyone involved, and then you kind of like you lose that thread for accountability and delegation, and how to run an organization responsibly. You can do that top down or bottom up, and this is just adding another dimension and some additional context to do a better job of managing those human resources once we scale past numbers where we know everyone personally.
Yeah, and that really, you mentioned Burning Man. It's kind of funny. I gave a 5-minute lightning talk on community graphs earlier this year, and somebody that works at Burning Man org approached me afterwards, and she said, we need this for Burning Man. And specifically what they're trying to solve is more long-term, is how do they decentralize their governance from a Burning Man org point of view. And they've got these over 100 of the regional burns that they track every year, and how do they make those smaller communities and track them and who belongs to them and who's more in a leadership position there, and be able to do this in a more decentralized manner rather than one person at the org, which is mainly her job now, to track all these things and who's the point person for each one, but it's all centralized on some spreadsheet, and it's not right. So it's not what they want to do long term.
So the thing that community graphs would help them to do really is that imagine a scenario where someone approaches central leadership in an org like Burning Man and says, "Hey, I represent this regional burn," and okay, maybe the assumption is that you do, and so you start interfacing with them until somebody else pops up and says, "Hey, they don't represent us. They're not legitimate." Well, you don't know either of these people really. Like, so do you want to be responsible for adjudicating and anointing one of them an official representative and imbuing them with the power that would come along with that, whatever that is? Well, what if alternately, you just ask them to participate in something like community graphs, which determines where collectively, the community views as more central to that group, within that context, and so you're able to capture that community sentiment for purposes like we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I had I was talking with Edmund Edgar, if you know who he is. He was talking about Augur, the old prediction market, and in a similar sense, like you have like the old model of how to deal with like community splits or stuff like that on if it's like an L1 chain is you just sort of fork, you create two, and then everyone can just sort of opt in, and that's like, you know, like you sort of have this ability, like kind of we were talking about with the subjectivity, like it can be, you can fork away and just sort of do your own thing. But I guess like would love to find out like the actual technical answer to like how do you deal with things that you can't fork away from, like with Augur's problem of like if you are holding external funds. So, you know, like in the Burning Man or the Zeus example on grants, like if you have a smart contract here with, you know, $500,000 worth of ETH in it, and you have to send it to somewhere, how can you like rely on these in any sort of trustworthy way?
Right, and that's one of the big use cases that this unlocks, is it improves governance for groups, right? So now instead of having, you know, you can have a group of anything, a DAO or any group that's trying to make a decision about anything, and how can they make better decisions instead of anointing like this person's the leader, this person's the admin, or whatever. You could say like this group is going to come up with membership levels for everyone, and then you could say, well, people with higher membership levels who are more central to a group, they get more votes, right? Or their vote counts more in whatever decision you happen to be making. And so it allows you to really improve decision making, because it gives legitimacy to the people who should have more of a say over those group decisions. And those people might also be better poised to preserve the values and ethos of that group. Like Jesse was talking about a vouching system. Like if you're trying to decide who should be invited into this group as the group grows, maybe the people who are more central to a group get to invite 3 people, and somebody who's more on the periphery only gets to invite 1 person. You know, it's kind of it's not just how many people are you vouching. It's not just how are you vouching for people, but who gets to invite more people into the group, who's better suited for doing that. So you can really improve community stewardship as well as community governance. Sorry, Jesse, if you're going to add something to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think this might be a good time to introduce the reputation systems that can be built on top of this, because that, you know, we can talk a little bit about how something like subject matter expertise or domain expertise might be the thing that you would want to weight more than just membership levels. If you'd like to introduce that to the conversation, Leah.
Yeah, that's you know, I always kind of categorize these things. One of the big things it unlocks is, you know, community stewardship and governance. The other one is, you know, you can really have more robust and scalable reputation systems. And the intuition behind that is, when we think about how reputations work offline, we build trust and credibility within groups, and that carries across to other groups through overlapping memberships. And we also tend to trust cohesive groups more than individuals sometimes, right? If a certain group holds a certain person's reputation in a certain regard, and you see that group carries certain values like honesty and integrity and so on, then you can actually trust that person's reputation, even without, you might not know any individual people in that group very much. And so you might not be able to trust them individually, what they say, but as a group, there's a certain level of cohesion and establishing of trust. And so by having this kind of group membership and mapping that on into a reputation system, to say it's not just how much do I trust Jesse, that he trusts Bob, that he trusts Alice. It's, well, I also know that Jesse belongs to this group, and so I'm going to give more trust to Jesse. And I'm also establishing reputation with this other group, and if he trusts that group, that carries weight. And the more overlapping memberships we have with one another, that reputation can then carry across. And you can actually scale that out really well, because if you just do reputation based on a social graph or like a web of trust, you lose, you know, again, I trust Jesse, he trusts Bob, he trusts Alice. After 3 or 4 hops, you kind of don't really trust that person anymore. But if you can trust certain communities, and those communities start having reputation, and they trust other communities and so on, now this can travel a lot further. So now, you know, if I go to somewhere like Japan, no one will trust my reputation based on a social graph because I'm too many steps removed from anyone there. But if I belong to certain communities that have a certain reputation and branding, they might trust those communities, and those communities are implicitly vouching for me. And now I have all sorts of reputation that I can take with me to Japan. That I'm an honest person. That I might pay money back if I borrow it. That I might be good at certain tasks or skills, so I can get a job easily, and so on. I might
And it
carry
does all,
certain.
and it does already
Yeah.
work this way. Just think about going to crypto conferences. If you introduce yourself as a representing or affiliated with a certain project, you might inherit a lot of that transitive reputation and credibility, or the opposite, depending on the protocol, the project, right?
Yeah, no, I guess the question would be, how do you prevent this from sort of devolving into what we have currently? This would be like the argument for crypto economic security versus reputational security. Like ideally, like in the Web 2 world, like, don't worry, this bank won't cheat you because their reputation is on the line. But like we obviously know, like, they do screw people over. Like, this politician won't lie, his reputation is on the line. Like, and he lies again. Like, to me, it seems like either there's a chance that people might not care about their reputation because reputations are actually pretty sticky in some ways. Like, once you get a good one, like, it's hard to almost trash. And then, yeah, and then the other question, kind of similar, would be like, do you see like KYC operators just popping up and being like, if you're part of the KYC operator network, then we validated your ID and you're good to trade.
So no, those are all excellent questions. So
Right.
reputation systems aren't perfect,
Yeah.
but let's take one example. Let's take the credit rating system in the U.S. We know it's not perfect, right? But if you've ever lived in a country without a credit rating system, you would much rather take the U.S. one, because otherwise you can just never borrow money for anything, and that becomes it's like there's just no credit available. I grew up in Bosnia myself, and I remember, as a kid, it's like you don't borrow money to build a house, or to buy a house. You just have to build it brick by brick over time, and maybe a generation later, your kids will get to live in it. But credit rating systems are extremely important, and obviously they can be better. But when we think about DeFi today, there is no such thing as uncollateralized lending, right? We are missing the vast majority of finance in the world. You can only do collateralized lending, but uncollateralized lending is the vast majority of borrowing, or you have collateralized lending as well, like with mortgages and cars, but cars they're not easy to repossess. But you can't do like unsecured credit cards and things like that, unsecured loans. So having a credit rating system opens up the door to a lot more DeFi, and you can always say, well, certain people will default, just like they do with a credit rating system. Real reputation, some people will sacrifice their reputation. Even it needs to be sticky. To your point, it has to be sticky. You can't just go create a new anon account and start from scratch. But if it is sticky, which requires a sticky identity system, then it opens up the door to a lot. And that's just one example. You can extend that to any other reputation system. It's like yes, people do sometimes sacrifice their reputations, but there's only two ways that we coordinate as human beings. And coordination is our superpower. It's either through reputation or through putting money down, right? And the money thing is a more recent innovation. Not just money down, but money incentives. Like, I pay you to do a job, you're going to do it because you're going to do it for the money. That's the one type of us coordinating. But if you want to coordinate without money, it's always reputation. It's always this person is going to do what they say they're going to do because their reputation's on the line. And so it unlocks a lot of social coordination tools by having reputation systems. And it's never 100% guaranteed, but we're missing all those otherwise entirely. So I think it's a big net good. Now on the topic of identity, that is one way. You could say there are certain KYC providers. Maybe Coinbase goes on there and says, "Look, we are going to provide KYC for people, and that can serve as their identity." And that's one great way of bringing identity online. The other thing that this unlocks is the ability to actually have a social Sybil resistance, because you can have a reputation system for being a unique personhood. Like, I'm a human being, and this is my unique account. You can actually design a reputation system with that, and by combining it with community graphs, you can actually unlock a social civil resistance, which can't be done with social graphs alone. It actually requires communities, and that's a longer conversation. I'm not sure we'll have time to dive exactly into that. But you could also have a reputation system that doesn't have any centralized providers or require biometrics like what WorldCoin is doing. So hopefully that's a long-winded answer there.
Yeah, and just to flag one more thing, maybe to dive into it another time, is just that there's you asked earlier in the conversation about whether identity was a part of our project, and aggregating identity is definitely something that we're doing. I do want to point out though that like we're not doing anything proprietary with identity. We're not building an identity solution any more than we're building a social media application. So we're really building like supportive substrate infrastructure, and principally, and really importantly, there's open competition at every layer, right? So we're unlocking a pace of innovation that is a result of an open ecosystem, a competitive marketplace for social media applications that can run on top of the operating system that we're building to facilitate that. Similarly, while we have to build the first portal that allows users to switch between these different applications, because that doesn't exist yet, we're going to open source that to encourage competition at that layer as well. And in exactly the same way, there will be a marketplace for different identity providers that can interoperate with the network to provide identity solutions that are compatible with the applications that they have business relationships with. So when users access the Maitri network, when they access applications through the Maitri network, they're issued a unique user ID that's never revealed to anyone. And one of the really important things that this unlocks is that basically we're able to enable inherently application-specific identities and application-specific social graphs with composability between them, so that a user is in control of whether they want to associate or disassociate their identity and social graphs across those applications. So you get the benefits of cross-pollination without having to worry about cross-contamination. If you want to think about, say, your professional social graph and your online dating social graph, those are two examples of things that you might want to keep separate and permission exceptionally in one-off cases.
No,
Jesse was jumping a little bit ahead there to the interoperability piece. I think that's probably
right.
good.
Yeah,
it's probably good to do, but just to finish out on maybe get to a point on community graphs where we can kind of put a little bit more of a bow tie around it. The reputation systems become extremely powerful. And one last thing I wanted to touch on there is the modularity and composability, which Jesse was lightly touching on, which is that community graphs are this infrastructure, and then from there anyone can create their own community. Anyone can determine the governance rules for that community. It can be completely centralized. I'm the king of this community. I'm the admin. No one else gets to do anything. I choose who gets let in, who gets kicked out, whatever. You have some groups that exist like that in real life. It can be fully decentralized all the way to, here's the governance mechanism. Here's how the rules of this community are changed by the votes of the members based on how they want to incorporate membership levels or not into those votes. This community is self-governing all the way, or anything in between. Like I, as an admin, get to override these rules, but all the other rules are for the community to decide, and so on. So, and anyone can build these governance templates, and anyone else in any community can basically copy and paste that template into their community, or build their own and make it available for others. They can choose their own algorithms for how attestations are converted into membership levels. They can choose how the community is gated, not just who gets invited in or not, but do you need an NFT, or do you need a certain other proof of identity or whatever? Do you need to have a certain score on some reputation system? Of which reputation systems do we want to allow? Anyone can build a reputation system, or any reputation system outside of community graphs can pool the members and membership levels into their reputation system to use it elsewhere. Every community can decide which reputation system or which application can pool their data and which data they can pool. So they can choose those permissions. And so it's all fully modular and composable in every way that we could possibly make it. So this whole idea is to kind of to create this ecosystem of let applications use this to improve how they serve communities. Let reputation systems use this. Let people use this however they wish, and let them build out whatever they wish from there. Hopefully that part makes sense.
Yeah, I think is it who's allowed to make the attestations? Is it only members of that community, or are you guys planning on having, like, say, like connecting to some Oracle network to pull in other social graphs? Like, like the Farcaster community, you could clearly just import all the data and have a community there.
So if you want to create a community, and you get to decide how those membership levels are determined, and you can say this is purely just based on the attestations of the people from here, or you can say no, we're going to pull in this other data source, and it might be from some Oracle, or it might be from a centralized data source. It might be someone who has these NFTs gets a membership level, or it could be someone who has these NFTs. Half the membership level is determined that way. The other half is determined from this voting algorithm, and you can just you can write any algorithm you want that pulls in this data and combines these other things, and whatever works for your community. So it's, yeah, again, very, very flexible in that front.
Cool. Yeah, because I was saying, like, like I'm part of a lot of social graphs in my own life, but
Absolutely,
very few of them are going to come attest on maitri.network.
exactly.
So,
No, that's exactly right. Yeah. And so, yeah, it's the ability to pull in all these things. There's so many other DAOs working on things that might say, like, look, you contributed this much code to our GitHub project. Well, it's like maybe that gets pulled into your reputation system for that DAO, right? So it can really be anything, yeah, including relationships and social graphs. Yeah, and so it might be a good time to now switch to, as Jesse was alluding to switch into the interoperability piece, which is separate but very, very related to this.
Yeah, I mean, on the interoperability, I'm guessing, so these community graphs and stuff like that, is this going to be on your own chain or somebody else's chain? And then how would I get it to my chain?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's there's a data piece and a computation piece, right?
Okay.
So the computation needs to be fully private. It needs to be private computation because you need the voting to be private. And if the voting is to be kept private, but then you run it through a public smart contract, it's then it's visible. You can see the inputs, right, coming into that smart contract. So you've broken the privacy. So we're exploring a couple of different ways to do private computation, but one way what we'll likely land is using Aztec, which is the privacy layer 2 on Ethereum, to do the computation, and then that would keep they're using their private smart contracts, and so that the computation happens on chain in that sense. The data is probably not on a blockchain because data storage on a blockchain is really expensive, but we end up using a decentralized data provider, something like IPFS, for example. And so the actual data, which gets fully encrypted, of who voted how and who is a member of what and at what membership level, that sits on a decentralized data layer that anyone can pull, but they can't decrypt. Only certain people can decrypt it, and then the computation is run through the blockchain. And so that's the overall decentralization architecture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I like it. Yeah, I'm curious to see how you do the sort of public reveal of the vote and everything like that, and keeping it private. I feel like that'll be a ZK challenge or something.
Yeah, there's ZK pieces. We're exploring a couple of different ways. One's a ZK way, one is a MPC multi-party computation way. So there's a couple of ways of doing it. Like what will be the most efficient is the question, because you have to do quite a bit of computation for some of these things.
Yeah, and then how do you see this sort of working, kind of with the other protocols? Do you see it being something that gets updated frequently with these other protocols, or do you see this being like more of like a KYC AML layer that you check like your credit score once a year kind of thing, and then you hopefully don't have to go check your credit score too often?
Yeah, it can be updated as frequently as we want it to. It's only a question of the cost of computation, right? So you don't want to recompute every reputation system every 5 minutes. That'll get costly, but maybe recomputing once every 24 hours is a good time to batch it or something like that. Wouldn't want to wait too long to recompute this stuff. The data can be pooled anytime by any application that has the right permissions. And so however often they need the data, the reading is cheap. It's the recomputing and writing that's much more expensive when you want to do it privately.
there's another way to answer this though that I think is worth looking at. Just the other lens we could look at this through is the behaviors that we want to incentivize and disincentivize. What we don't want to create is like a dystopian Black Mirror episode, like, oh, like, follow, and review after every interaction. Upvote, downvote each time you interact with somebody. Like, that's really not the behavior that we want to incentivize. We can actually disincentivize that though by saying, hey, if someone is being too dramatic, like, like revoting, re-rating people too frequently, you can turn the volume down on their attestation. So there are certain ways that we can account for that, but like Leah has said several times, maximally modular and composable to suit the needs of different communities, which are going to be different. But imagine if you're a DAO that you do quarterly reviews or something. Maybe you need to participate in making these attestations quarterly in order to maintain the weight of your own vote. So you could create a ton of different incentive mechanisms to get what's on the other side of participation, which could be governance or other rewards, better governance or other rewards.
Yeah. No, and kind of on a more broader philosophical question, this was I had just listened to his ZK podcast episode with Arnott, or yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Arnott Beck. And he was talking about how, like, basically, like, anytime you have digital sort of, any digital social media or anything like that, like, it's so hard to actually have good communications and good interactions with people. Like, you and I we met at a hackathon and we had a good conversation, like meeting randomly for 5 seconds. And then, like, but yet you can be on a social platform for years and you never have a good social interaction. And I think the similar thing comes in, like, yeah, like, it's just, how can this sort of help? How can we sort of get back, like, is the solution making social media better in some way, or is it, like, kind of like you had said, making the social group smaller, or even pushing us towards doing
Yeah,
things?
I think the point that you touch on about, like, going back to the comments I made about steering people really deliberately back towards smaller groups of people where they can have those higher quality interactions. Thematically, that's one of the most consistent things across everything that we're doing. Is the idea that, like, I'm really sentimental about the early days of the internet, the forums and bulletin boards where you found like real camaraderie around points of common interest. And that kind of gave way to more generalized social media feeds where people are shouting into the void. And one of the ways that community graphs and the interoperability layers that we're building can help with that is that you can filter for quality across a bunch of different axes. So you could say, hey, I only want to hear from people on the range of our shared interests or within a certain reach of our social graphs, like, degrees of distance, or above a certain membership threshold within these groups that I hold in high esteem. So you can just keep slicing that in different directions to find an intersection of higher quality content.
Yeah, to build on that, if we can think about the evolution of social media, it's exactly what Jesse said. Like, first we started with these kind of large social graphs that I and many people I know don't post on Facebook anymore because there's rarely something I want to say to 900 different friends and acquaintances at the same time. It's like giving a wedding speech times 50. Like, when do you want to say something to everyone you've ever met, and then the conversation devolves quickly because you're some guy you met at a party 5 years ago starts having a back and forth with your aunt in your comments, and you're like, debating about Trump, and you're like, this was not my audience. We need, this isn't how we operate. And so what we've seen is people naturally spending less time on those platforms and moving in the direction of smaller groups. And that's given rise to Discord and Telegram, really. Like, so many of us are spending most of our time on these smaller groups and communities within Telegram and Discord. It's just that those tools are limited, and there's two things that are missing. One is still it's binary. You're either in a Telegram group or you're not, and so we end up with this huge signal or noise to signal ratio, a really bad signal to noise ratio, because most of the groups we're only in the periphery, but we're getting spammed by everything that's going on. And it's like, how do we filter for what's really important? Like, there's a lot of groups where if somebody who's more central to the group says something, I want to be notified. Otherwise, I don't I don't really want to, I don't have the time to read all the messages. So it's missing the membership levels to really improve those. And the other thing is that these group mappings are still proprietary. Like the groups within Telegram, no other application can plug into and use those in a different way. The groups within Discord servers, nobody else can easily use those in different ways. But if this grouping existed elsewhere that all the applications could plug into, now they can serve these same groups in a lot of different ways. It creates a lot of innovation. And so that's where
with a permission of those groups, obviously.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's where, I think we're already seeing people wanting to move in that direction. That's where it creates more meaningful interactions, because we don't have meaningful interactions on Twitter or Facebook, but we sometimes do have meaningful interactions on Discord or Telegram. And so we do know that Arnaud's a great guy. We both know him. I love his thinking in this area. I haven't seen that particular podcast, but I've read some of his thoughts on this topic, with especially using ZKs within social media. And so I think I can imagine what he said on that podcast, and yeah, fully agree with him on his points there.
Yeah, I mean, would you guys say there's like a trade-off between almost the openness of a community and how big it is versus like how good of communication you can have? like is the result of this that we close off our communities more and have concrete groups of people?
I think there's a difference. Sorry, I think there's a difference between the size of the community and the size of the groups we interact with, right? So you and I can both imagine communities that are, let's say, 500 people that we belong to. But when we meet in those communities, we're never speaking to other 499 people. We get into smaller groups. And then within those groups, we have conversations, and that's where the conversations are much more meaningful. We can speak more freely. We can interact with each other in a lot less performative way, and so on. So it's depending on what you're using it for. So you can still have a community of 500 people for governance purposes, but then you want to have sub-communities within that.
Or all together in one place. I mean, imagine that you're just socializing at a large event, and you can move freely between conversations, many smaller conversations that are all happening simultaneously.
Right, but if you want to fence off those conversations, Jesse, and say, like, I'm talking to 6 other people right now, and I don't want the rest of the 500 to see that. Now you can easily create sub communities within that, or do it some other way, to be able to easily to accomplish something like that, and have those more intimate conversations.
Yeah, no, I think that's what you kind of see in Discord. You like make a separate group with
exactly
4 of us, and then we sort of go on our own way.
Exactly.
No, that's super cool. All right, now onto the interoperability.
Great. Yeah. So the other piece of this is, so now what we've said is, all right, we've got community graphs that anyone can plug into, or other social graphs that anyone can plug into, like Farcaster and Lens. Those are very purpose built for certain type of social media. Mainly, they are both replicating this kind of Twitter model. That's the easiest model to replicate first when you're decentralizing. And then we can also imagine there's a bunch of small applications out there that have more centralized social graphs. And so the goal is, how do we bring all this together? And one of the main things we want to do is architect this in a way so that it's no longer a winner take all outcome. And because we don't think that one should be a winner, especially not a centralized one. Then you get like a Facebook or a Twitter. But even a decentralized one, we don't think that one should win to dominate all of them. And first, why would there only be one protocol to rule them all in that sense? But second, any protocol, a decentralized protocol that becomes widely adopted, is really hard to change, right? If we think about protocols like SMTP for email, good luck changing SMTP, right? Once everyone's on the same protocol, it becomes very ossified, and so that limits innovation. You can't really innovate on SMTP, and so similarly, if one decentralized kind of a protocol for a social graph becomes widely adopted, it limits innovation in the same way. And so what we want to do is say, how do we allow all of these to interoperate and coexist? And that's where we add an interoperability layer, which we do through what we call portals. You can think of a portal as almost kind of an operating system. And if you think of the applications and social graphs as apps, right? And so this is the layer that plugs in, and it allows for indirect interoperability. So if you, like an example might be, or an analogy might be where we have operating systems and applications, or like if we take smartphones, for example, you have iOS and Android as the operating systems, and you have about 1 million applications sitting on top of that. And so if we can recreate the same in social media, well, it's no longer a winner take all market. Just like in smartphones, you have competition with iOS and Android and many different forks of Android, and then you have competition between all the applications. It breaks the winner take all. Even though there's really strong network effects in the ecosystem, at each layer, there's competition, and so everyone knows that if you wall off and say, I'm not going to interoperate with this ecosystem anymore, all your customers can jump over to your competitor and access the greater network. And even if you're the market leader, even if you're Apple, if you wall off iOS, everyone goes to Android, or almost everyone, because they want to get access to all the applications. And so the goal here is to recreate the same in social media. And so we build this interoperability layer, which we call portals, and a user chooses a portal. We're building the first portal. We're going to open source that to invite competition, so more of an Android model. And a user chooses a portal, and through that portal, they access all their social media, all these applications. And some of those applications can be using Farcaster social graph. They can be using a Lens social graph, or some of them might be just having their own social graph centralized on AWS or wherever. But they're all incentivized to keep interoperating, and so it allows for a very healthy competitive ecosystem. And the other thing it does is it allows for scaling, because all of those are brought into a single user interface. And the interface itself, you can kind of think of it as a social media browser. So from this one interface, you can access many applications, easily switch between them, and have a unified set of interoperability, whether it's notifications or messaging, aggregating social graphs, and so on, discovering new apps very, very easily, being able to add new apps without installing and downloading anything, setting up a new username and password, and so on. So it creates a very much more seamless user experience, and it allows us to easily switch between many applications. So anyway, that's the kind of the overall big picture, if that makes sense, for the interoperability piece.
Is this going to be sort of its own sort of chain type thing, or just like an OS software system you download?
This is predominantly off-chain, and so it's an app that you download, and that can run other apps inside of it. And so it's kind of like a WeChat type architecture, being able to run apps inside of apps. But the way the apps talk to one another is, on the front end, they can run within one another, and if they need to interoperate on the back end, that would be through APIs. And there is a blockchain piece, which is there's a revenue share component where the applications generate the revenue. They share the revenue with the portal and the users, and that settles on the blockchain. So there's a financial settlement piece that goes on a smart contract on Ethereum, but the rest of it is done off chain, and that's what enables really, really fast innovation, because we can keep most of it off chain.
Yeah, that sounds, it's almost like an Urbit style model in some ways. Like you can build applications just on a very base level system, and hopefully everything can interoperate. But
Yeah, the idea is that we're using economic decentralization to achieve credible neutrality, and the network itself runs permissionless and censorship free. We have and then we're facilitating all of the interoperability technically off chain, really for the purpose of creating a maximally flexible and minimally prescriptive protocol for interoperability, so that we can be chain agnostic, as to what protocols what chain protocols want to build on across Web3, but also, and even more importantly, this is how we bridge Web2 to Web3 social media, so that to Leo's point, we can facilitate interoperability across centralized and decentralized social media applications, which is really important to bridge that gap, because while aspirationally we're super supportive of Web3 social, we want to get to the promised land. It's going to take some time, and we want to create these shared network effects to help us get there.
Yeah, and this is a really important point about economic decentralization, because we're in the Web3 space, we're so used to thinking of decentralization as being synonymous with technical decentralization. You have to put it on some blockchain or some peer-to-peer, a protocol. But that's not truly what decentralization means. That's just one version of decentralization. Economic decentralization is true as well. Like if you think about certain industries, like think about dentist offices, right? That's a very decentralized market. None of it's on the blockchain, but you have so many choices to choose your own dentist that there's it's just economically decentralized. No, the power is not centralized with any one entity, and so we don't have a societal level problem from some dentist monopoly pulling our teeth, you know. So similarly, the idea here is let's economically decentralize um, social media, and we solve a lot of the problems without everything having to be on the blockchain.
Yeah, well, I mean, it seems like so you start with this problem of like you have this social, like it's almost like a market failure because you have network effects lead to social market social.
That's exactly. Yeah, they lead to natural monopolies. It's exactly a market failure. Yeah.
Right. So then to fix it, what we're going to do is we're basically going to almost break up communities so that way you disincentivize these giant behemoth. Basically, you're almost like limiting the network effects in some way, right? Like naturally limiting the network effects.
I would say that a little differently, because
Okay.
that's like when you say break up the communities, that makes me think of like antitrust style intervention, where we're gonna like make all the railroad tracks different sizes and like bridge transportation. The equivalent of that in social media is like really the only regulatory intervention, right? This is an alternative. This is an alternative to that, which preserves the network effects, but it basically, by delineating between the layers that applications are going to cooperate on and where they're going to compete on, we're realigning the incentives toward cooperative competition with a shared network effects, and they're competing for market share in a more meritocratic manner on features and functionality, much in the same way as mobile phone applications do. I mean, it's a very competitive landscape, but it's not purely your network effect that create a moat, which leads to the winners and losers.
Yeah, another way to think about that is at the very early on, I was talking about whoever owns the social graph owns the network, and that's the problem, and that's where the market failure is. In this new architecture, it's no longer whoever owns the social graph owns the entire network. You have greater network effects, which are an emergent property of the interoperability. Just like with iOS and Android and all these apps, no single person owns the network. It's the interoperability between all of them that creates the greater network effects. And so we make it so that interoperability is the thing that's required for the greater network effects. Eventually, the network effects are actually larger than they would be, right? Right now, you have fragmentation between what's on Lens, what's on Farcaster, what's on Twitter, what's on Facebook, what's on all these other ones. These are fragmented networks. Ultimately, we end up with everyone being on the same network. You end up with greater network effects, but it's no longer the ownership of the social graph that determines who owns the network. Nobody owns the network. So you actually, if that makes sense.
And that's permissioned at each end by the applications and the users. So from the applications perspective, one of the big unlocks here is, as Leo was talking about indirect interoperability, it's really important to emphasize that we're allowing users to switch between different applications that preserve the full intended front-end experience, the UX of these applications that they put so much time and money and intention into creating for their users. And we allow users to switch between those. We're not just aggregating this all into one bowl of mashed potatoes, right? And similarly, there's another really important element to this, which is when you ask about on the topic of decentralization and trust and trustlessness. One of the things that we're able to do is to allow applications to optionally encrypt their data, which is not decrypted until it reaches their users. So when Leo made a comparison to WeChat, I want to emphasize that this is like a very decentralized alternative to something like WeChat in form and functionality. Sure, similar, but not controlled to any extent. Similarly, in terms of like how centralized it is. So applications being able to optionally encrypt their data until it reaches their user is one kind of trustlessness. And then users being able to permission to share those social graphs with us in order to aggregate them for them is another kind of permission, because the social graphs exist at the application layer. Each of the applications has a social graph for their user, right? But then the user, because all of this can be happening in a trustless manner when it passes through a portal, we're blind. We might be blind to that content. So a user is in control then of permissioning those social graphs to be shared with us. So they might do that for 4 out of 5 applications and say, hey, this fifth one actually, I don't. While I have composability to associate or disassociate that with my identities and across these other applications, like I don't want to even pass that back to you, the portal operator. So that's what I mean by it being permissioned on each end, so that this is like maximally consensual and not at all coercive or extractive. There's no data scraping going on as any part of our business model here.
Well, yeah, but I think there's something more important here on that topic, Jesse, which is that the trust comes from the portability of first, anyone can fork the open source of the portal and create a competitor. The applications can do it, or a user can do it, and your relationship to other people isn't controlled by the portal; it's controlled by the application. So similarly to how if you switch from iOS to Android, all you have to do is relog into all your applications. You still have your Uber, you still have your DoorDash, you still have all the same applications. It doesn't break that at all. So you can easily switch from iOS to Android, not super easily because of some other things, but you're not locked in the way you're locked into a Facebook or a Twitter. Like you can't easily go from a Twitter to a Twitter competitor because that entire social graph is walled off by Twitter. But to switch from one portal to another, you log into all those same applications. If I follow you, let's say there's a Instagram type application, but let's say there's 6 or 8 of them because now they're competing. I might follow you on one of them. I might follow Jesse on another. I'm getting all of that in my feed. It feels like one. It feels like one social graph, but it's not. If I switch to another portal, I log into all those same 6 or 8 applications, and I still follow you and follow Jesse on those applications. The social graphs are maintained, so I can just switch. I can just switch between portals very easily. I don't have to go rebuild that. And similarly, if I'm on one of those applications and I don't like the way that application's treating me, well, I can just switch to a different application. They don't have that much control over me because my relationships are spread across many of these, and so that means they're not going to want to block me or censor me, because they'll lose me very easily as a user. So it gives the power back to the user on both ends. And that's really the goal here the goal of decentralization is to decentralize power.
Yeah, no, I think, how much opt-in pieces do you think you're going to need from community members? And this goes back to my question of like, who do you think is actually going to be attesting? Because like this takes, like the one nice thing about say Facebook or Twitter is that they handle it all for you. Like I don't have to do anything, and the average person doesn't have to do anything. Like, do you see it sort of being that same sort of way as far as everything is just sort of building and attesting automatically, or is there?
To clarify, it's important to draw a distinction here between social graphs and community graphs. So when we're talking about the interoperability piece, it's really for the purposes of social graphs. All these applications can also plug into community graphs, but what it's solving for more is on the social graph side. Like when I'm talking about following you on an Instagram type application, following Jesse, those are all social graphs, and it's a way to break up that winner take all. On the community graph side, a bunch of applications can plug into the same community graphs. That's going to also be decentralized, and it can also bring all of them into the same view. But these things are a little bit independent in the sense that even if I do no testing on community graphs, it still solves this problem on the social graph side. And the community graphs is a way to improve the social media experience and solve all these other problems of how do we interact better in social media, how do we have better reputation systems, better governance, and so on. So these are all very complementary, and they can build on top of one another. But to answer your question about attestations, that is a point that's going to be a bit of a ask of users to say every once in a while you have to go or not have to, but in order to get the benefit of this, you need to go test for people, whether it's on the community membership side or the reputation side. And that's where the benefits have to outweigh the costs. And over time, the friction can be drastically reduced with the AI tools, right? So you can imagine in a couple of years, instead of me having to go into some application and a test for Jesse. After I had a conversation with Jesse, I could just go to my phone and be like, hey, increase Jesse's membership score by 20% and move on with my life, and it's just going to do it, right? And so you can make it a lot more seamless, but someone still has to go do the thing. Yeah, ultimately there has to be more benefit to doing it than not. So yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I mean, I imagine like the future, like if you imagine like the Web 2 model of what a community graph would be like, it would just be like the panopticon watching you, and it would like look at how long you're looking at each thing and how much you like each person, and it would have like its own social credit score that was built by the all-encompassing AI. And then
the ISR,
could plug it into here, and then you could do
yeah.
it. It's like
these are things. So any application will be able to build on top of community graphs and allow you to give attestations within community graphs from within that application. So people can build their own interfaces and stuff like that. Some applications might build this like AI thing I'm talking about. Some other ones might say, we're going to automate everything for you. We're going to monitor all your text messages with people and automatically adjust these things for you. And if somebody builds that and other people want it, okay. But it won't be the only option. It'll never be a one size fits all. You might have 10 options within that. And our big guiding philosophy here is never have a one size fits all. Even on the social media side, I hate the concept of advertising. I don't want to be advertised to. I'd rather pay a subscription, but we want to support all models. Some people would prefer to be advertised to, and they don't care about their privacy. And some people do care and rather pay subscription. Some people want in-app purchases, which are very common in gaming. And so let all these things coexist. There's no one size fits all. Just like in like movies and TV shows, there's really good movies and TV shows, and then there's the Kardashians. And I don't want to watch the Kardashians. I don't want to make that TV show,
right.
but I'm okay with it existing if that's what other people want to consume. And we just, as long as we all have options and we can all choose, that's the more important thing at a societal level, than saying like, no, every movie out there should be as good as Shawshank Redemption, or we shouldn't have it, right? And it's like, no, that's not the right solution either.
Yeah, no, I'm rooting for you guys. It's tough because I feel like a lot of these crypto too was kind of trying, how do you break up these natural monopolies of whether it's a currency or a stock market or something like that, and we're trying to like financialize our way to success, but it's
right.
like, are we doing it? It's like, I don't know. It's
yeah,
like,
I think with things like money, there is a place to be financializing these things. You're working within the monetary sphere, but when you're dealing with social, the last thing you want to do is be monetizing relationships. And that takes the value and the human element out of it. We don't want to be, it's funny when you talk to economists, sometimes they try to always find games of like monetizing everything, every transaction and every interaction. And it's just like, you guys have lost the plot, you should, it's like, you can't monetize everything. It loses its meaning.
well, that's what I almost thought of here. Like how much of this could be a negative signal? Like determine, like if I'm going to trust somebody, the one thing I always think of is like LinkedIn recommendations. If you have like a bunch of LinkedIn recommendations, but that actually tells me is this like you probably don't have a job, like, and you're looking.
That's right.
Like because like if you actually had a job, you'd like never go on LinkedIn. So like how do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think it really depends. It depends on the reputation system, depends on how widely adopted it is, and depends on how well implemented it is, and like if a restaurant doesn't have any Yelp reviews, that might tell me that they might not want to pay Yelp for any reviews to be listed, which is they could still be a good restaurant. It might tell me that I'm in a part of the world where Yelp is not widely adopted, so it doesn't mean anything. Or it might tell me that it's not a good restaurant and no one gave Yelp reviews. If a restaurant has 2 Yelp reviews, that's probably the worst signal, because it's like you could only get 2 people to review you. Like what's going on there, right?
Yeah.
But then if I'm in a place where in like the Bay Area and a restaurant has 4.5 stars on Yelp, it's like that's a really strong signal. So it's just going to be contextual, just like any other reputation system, and we all have, we're all just going to learn what to apply when.
For sure. Yeah. Well, guys, this was a blast. This was a great conversation. I guess where can people find out more, and what do you guys? Yeah, what's next for you guys?
Jesse?
Yeah, our website is maitri.network. That's maitri.network. And you can find more information about portals and community graphs there, as well as different ways to be in touch with us if you'd like to reach out to be in touch.
Super cool. Yeah. Well, thank you guys so much, and we'll have to follow up whenever you guys launch, and we can get some details on it. So.
Sounds great.
Appreciate that. Thanks. Yeah, we released our alpha for Community Graph last month at Zoo Georgia. So we do have an open alpha if anybody would like to come play or build with us.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Thanks again.
Much pleasure.
Appreciate
Thanks
it.
for having us.